history that we are currently experiencing and what got us here, because Ben identified it along with co-author David Horowitz. And that book was cited by our men and women of Congress, understanding where we are today. You want to look at Iraq and the statements that are being made about Iraq, about political decisions and our national security being put on the altar of politics? Well, Ben Johnson wrote about it and identified the moment that happened in the Democratic Party in 2004, in the 2004 election primary season. Ben, welcome back. How are you?
Thank you. Great to be with you on a Friday as always.
Yeah, and we just talked to a good friend of yours. You've written articles with him as well, Colonel Gordon Kukulu. We had on in the first hour, and as you know, Gordon and you or the Colonel and you, pardon me, are regular guests on the broadcast and have been for years. You are the guest host of Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth, and we love you. Let me ask you this, Ben. When I begin with this clip, it's clip number 15, and this goes to what was happening earlier this week on why didn't we do something initially when we had the opportunity. And Colonel Ralph Peters, another friend of the Colonel's, and I think you know him, and here he is commenting on when Iraq was being attacked by ISIS and it began, we had an opportunity. Roll it.
Well, no, the staging areas in advance would have been excellent targets for drones or for manned aircraft, for cruise missiles. But the Obama administration just doesn't want to do anything militarily in Iraq, no matter what the price is. And now that they've delayed, the targeting would be much, much harder. When the troops are all gathered in a camp, it's easy to hit them. Now that they're stretched out on roads in a variety of vehicles, including a lot of civilian vehicles, civilian clothes, how do you tell them from the refugees? So the only way to do the airstrikes and make it work would be to put special ops spotters on the ground. We're not going to do that. The only real way to stop this onslaught, if the Iraqis can't, would be troops on the ground. We're not going to do that.
And he's been right. We're not going to put troops on the ground. But then he made this statement about President Obama's legacy. Roll it.
Patty Ann, this is President Obama's real legacy. The creation of the first jihadi state in modern history, stretching from central Syria to central Iraq and now approaching Baghdad, all because President Obama saw everything through a political lens, was going to end the war in Iraq, refused to negotiate seriously for residual U.S. presence. And now, just to put this in perspective for viewers, with this jihadi conquest of Mosul and jihadi forces approaching Baghdad, this is shaping up to be the biggest Arab jihadi victory since the 12th century, 1187, and the fall of Crusader Jerusalem. Wow. This is momentous. I can't overstate the importance. So, Obama's jihadi state in the heart of the Middle East.
Tell me, is he right?
He's exactly right. This was always the Islamist playbook from the very beginning. Their goal was to, first of all, target so-called moderate Muslims, people who were not radical Salafists or Islamists the way that they are, and to topple them, and then to somewhere in the world create a caliphate. This was the Islamic form of government that existed for so long, established by the followers of Muhammad. It would be run by the fundamentalist interpretation of the Quran. In their book, there is no separation of mosque and state. Everything must be run according to Sharia law. And that was what they tried to establish under the Taliban, and that is what they've been trying to establish in the Middle East, and particularly in Iraq, Syria, and in that region. And it looks as though, unless something drastic is going to take place, they've certainly had a staging area there for some number of years, but it looks as though the government in Iraq is in genuine peril. These groups will be stronger. They will be able to push forward, and from Iraq, if they are able to topple Iraq, they will continue to expand northward into Syria, probably throughout the region into Lebanon, which has had a civil war within our lifetime and is going to be pushed to the brink again. And if you think of the Middle East, next to the Palestinian state and Egypt, the next two nations that are most important for peace in the Middle East are Syria and Lebanon. Seeing lawful office in power or in the verge of power there, or having those states plunge into chaos, threatens to push the entire region to the brink.
So, with that in mind, we are making decisions that have been made in our response to this and the threat that you've outlined brilliantly. We are making decisions based on not the national security per se, in the sense of the threat that it will present, or the blood and treasure that we have spent, or the being the leader of the free world. We're basing those on politics. And that goes to a number of things that have been said regarding our national security and President Obama's approach to Afghanistan and Iraq even beforehand. And I want to skip just ahead here a bit to a debate that took place between Mitt Romney and President Obama regarding troops in Iraq. And this is very important because it's recent history, and President Obama had made it clear that troops in Iraq was not the way to go. Roll it.
You say that you're not interested in duplicating what happened in Iraq, but just a few weeks ago you said you think we should have more troops in Iraq right now. And the challenge we have, I know you haven't been in a position to actually execute foreign policy, but every time you've offered an opinion, you've been wrong. You said we should have gone into Iraq, despite the fact that there were no weapons of mass destruction. You said that we should still have troops in Iraq to this day. You indicated that we shouldn't be passing nuclear treaties with Russia, despite the fact that 71 senators, Democrats and Republicans, voted for it.
I'm sorry, that's it.
You made a major speech.
I indicated that you failed to put in place a status of
Governor,
forces agreement at the end of the conflict that existed.
Governor, here's one thing I've learned as Commander-in-Chief. You've got to be clear, both to our allies and our enemies, about where you stand and what you mean. Now, you just gave a speech a few weeks ago in which you said we should still have troops in Iraq. That is not a recipe for making sure that we are taking advantage of the opportunities and meeting the challenges of the Middle East.
Now, Ben, I play that only to highlight that President Obama has been clear about getting troops out. And when he withdrew the troops, when he did the troop withdrawal, didn't come up with the status of forces agreement, he never believed in having troops there. And we're looking at the consequence of not having troops there. So it's clear as day that his plan has led, or lack thereof, his strategy, or lack thereof, has led to the events currently. Is that fair?
I think you can draw a clear line from candidate Barack Obama in 2007 all the way to what we're seeing today. It shouldn't surprise anyone who was watching him at that time. You remember in July 2007, he was asked about what would happen if we withdrew the troops and there was genocide in Iraq. And they used the term genocide. He said, even if there were genocide, it wouldn't be a reason to have troops in Iraq. Well, that's what you're beholding today. And unfortunately, the ones who are the victims of the genocide, of course, are Christians, but also those who are not radical Muslims, those who are at the mercy of Al-Qaeda as it reestablishes its caliphate under his watch. Obama in 2007, July of 2007, said that our staying there would only encourage irresponsible behavior by Iraqi factions. If we were to stay there, we would stir up more violence than if we got out. Because Barack Obama and the left, you recall this very well, the same rhetoric from Harry Reid, Nancy Pelosi, everyone else. We were the reason that there was a war in Iraq. If we would get out, everything would be Pacific. It would be like downtown Schenectady if we would only get out of Iraq. And lo and behold, what happened is that we see this anti-Christian genocide, the establishment of a caliphate, and the fact that we no longer have forces there. Yet Obama said in 2007, and this is a quote, there's still going to be U.S. forces in the region that could intercede that could intervene with an international force on an emergency basis. Well, we've seen what happens. If you don't have troops on the ground, you have exactly what Ralph Peters talked about in the first clip that we played. We don't have the kind of targets that we once did. We don't have the ability to go in with special forces, which I think is probably what we'll end up doing, whether we announce it or not. We'll have covert operations. But whether that's going to be enough or not certainly remains to be seen. And all of this was foreseeable from before he was ever elected.
And speaking of 2007, we actually have a clip of President Obama in an MSNBC interview speaking to the issue of the surge and opposing the surge and his philosophy with Senator McCain, highlighting some of the things you spoke of. But roll it.
One of the things that I strongly disagree with Senator McCain, though, is this notion that we have future catastrophe to look forward to if we start phasing down troops. We are in the catastrophe that Senator McCain described right now. We've got bloodletting taking place. We see great influence of Iran in the region as a consequence of us moving forward. And so those of us who object to what I consider to be a disastrous policy on the part of the Bush administration have in fact put forward a different approach, one that, by the way, tracks what the Iraq Study Group talked about. 2 months before the Iraq Study Group came out with its proposal, I suggested that if we initiate a phased withdrawal, that provides us leverage to make sure that the Iraqis are actually doing what needs to be done to arrive at a political accommodation. And Senator McCain and the President seem to believe that only a military solution can accomplish our goals there.
He said in the very beginning there that we have a catastrophe right now, and you think withdrawing troops would provide a future catastrophe, denying that. Denying the future catastrophe. The future catastrophe is here.
Precisely. He has said that if we would have gotten out of Iraq, everything would have worked out. Iraqis would have worked out their own problems. And matter of fact, as I said, even though these results were completely foreseeable in 2006, 2007, even in 2004, when Howard Dean was proposing something along these lines, all of us said the state will descend into chaos right now if we were to do so. But if you follow exactly what happened after we did leave, chaos has ensued. But in 2006, 2007, when the Democratic leadership was putting forward bills to withdraw everyone in 90 days and so on, they said, the Iraqis really need to take responsibility for themselves. And if they can't handle this, well, then that's just too bad for them. So all of this is directly attributable to what Barack Obama and the House Democratic leadership, the Senate Democratic leadership, and the Democratic leaders of the party 2004, 5, 6, 7, 8, all of them were willing to forecast. They all basically said their blood is on our hands and we don't care.
What does this mean, Ben, for our credibility and for our allies right now, presently, Israel? What does it mean for Bibi Netanyahu? What is he? You think he's reaching out to the White House right now saying, hey, you've got to do something? Or does he recognize something that we had speculated on for some time, that what you've just said, this administration is fine with surrendering and having a Islamic State? They're okay with it.
I'm certain that Netanyahu's reaching out on every conceivable level, but I don't think that he's going to hold his breath. I think that he fundamentally has given up on Barack Obama and moving him certainly to any kind of intervention in that area. But I think that the broader issue here is that Barack Obama fundamentally has a negative outlook toward everyone who's a U.S. ally, the same way that the Democratic Party did during the Cold War, how they looked negatively toward all of those who were on our side and positively toward those who were favorably inclined to the Soviets. They have an anti-American agenda, an anti-American vision, and I think if you look at Barack Obama, for example, he's sort of the anti-Colin Powell. Colin Powell said, if you break it, you bought it. Barack Obama basically wants to break all of the Middle East. As a matter of fact, not just the Middle East. I mean, he's broken our insurance program. He's broken our healthcare system. He's breaking the bank. He's breaking the border. And now he's breaking the Middle East through his encouragement of the Arab Spring, particularly you can think of the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak and this U.S. ally being on the border of Israel, where the tunnels where the weapons go through into the West Bank. being replaced by a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, and then eventually, thank goodness, being replaced by a more competent and more moderate person, Abdel al-Sisi. But you see that there. In Tunisia, even, we often don't talk about Tunisia. Tunisia, a repressive government, yes, but when that repressive dictator was overthrown, Ansar al-Sharia was freed, and so you have issues there. In Libya, Gaddafi had surrendered his nuclear program, had surrendered his, his weapons of mass destruction program, and was essentially pacified by the Bush administration. Obama swept him out of power, and suddenly Al-Qaeda is on the run in Libya. So I think that essentially he is breaking down every moderate government and setting loose the powers of chaos, the powers of Al-Qaeda, the very forces that have the potential to take out the immediate enemy, which is moderate Muslims, moderate members of their own religion, and then the intermediate enemy, which is Israel, and then ultimately they'll turn their guns on the great Satan, which is you and I.
And what you've just articulated, why don't we hear more of? Because it's right. It's absolutely right, and it's the recognition. And within 2 minutes, what you've just stated is why we need to be engaged. And not only that, many different ways to fight a war, not invade or do nothing, the false choice that is oftentimes presented. But why don't we hear more people say what you just talked about, Ben? Because if we don't hear that was just right there. Bam. Why are we fighting in Afghanistan? Well, you can disagree with why we're there, or excuse me, how we're doing it, rules of engagement, etc. Overall, but there's a reason, and here it is. It's 3-tier. And what we're seeing is we're the third, but the consequence, especially in the nuclear age, and the idea that we no longer have mutually assured destruction when people are welcoming a genocidal Armageddon, we've got to act. So why aren't we hearing more of what you just articulated?
I think there are two reasons. One of them is political cowardice. We're essentially trapped between this false dichotomy of either invading the entire world or doing absolutely nothing around the world, and allowing the Islamists a completely free hand. This is a false dichotomy. There are ways to engage. There are ways to be involved without a full-scale, boots-on-the-ground invasion throughout the entire universe. And certainly without going to war with 1 billion people who happen to adhere to the Islamic religion, and many of whom would themselves be victims if the caliphate were established. On the other hand, there's a need to understand that there's a deep consequence not only to that region but to us if we do nothing. You're seeing it play out right now in Iraq, but again, they are the first enemy, and then there are intermediate enemies between them and us. And we are the ultimate goal. We are the great Satan that they wish to topple. So I think that that false dichotomy between doing everything and doing nothing is holding us back. And those are basically the two forces that have control of the two political parties. They're going to have to thrash it out and come up with some place in the middle that is sensible and is rooted in patriotism and in the national security of the United States. So I think that's the main reason. The other one is that American people are basically disengaged. They really see these as long-term threats. Don't pose the same sort of threat that a nuclear winter would, as you mentioned. 9/11, they're willing to overlook. But as David Horowitz and I mentioned in our book, Party of Defeat, all through the Clinton administration, there were attacks on U.S. embassies, attacks on U.S. ships overseas, attacks by Al-Qaeda throughout the region, and Osama bin Laden proclaiming very clearly to Western journalists like Peter Arnett what his goals were, and yet Bill Clinton was willing to look the other way because it didn't cost that many people, and he could say that everything was just fine. We had a big Dow over 10,000. That's part of the problem, is this willingness to pretend that everything is great, everything is fine, and we don't need to worry or look for enemies. It was a problem in Winston Churchill's day. It's a problem in our day.
And so if history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, how bad do you see this thing getting?
Well, for Christians in the Middle East, it's catastrophic. We certainly see that when the ISIL overran Mosul, the Christian population has been decimated. But it's been that way throughout Iraq for years now. The Christian population, again, dwindling in that area, and I think that we as Westerners and as Christians, have a real interest in protecting Christianity in the region in which it grew up. You know, Mosul, the governor of Mosul is referred to as the governor of Nineveh. That's certainly a biblical term. So that's catastrophic for Christians there. There's a genocide going on, and none of us are engaged in any way, shape, or form. So that I think is bad. But then once a caliphate is established, it will attract people from all over the world under the safe covering and umbrella of a formal, perhaps distended or perhaps informally aligned government, which has at least its own form of competence and legitimacy, which can offer protection and sustenance to the most dangerous forces in the entire world. This is bad. This is very, very bad.
It sounds to me like part of this also has been allowed to continue and grow in strength because our leaders haven't identified, except for the likes of Tony Perkins and AFA and works of identifying Christians who are being persecuted around the world, but it seems to me there's been a willful blindness toward them. Has that also come from the church in the sense of uniting as the body of Christ to say, here are our followers who are being slaughtered, and coming together and exerting some type of pressure politically?
Well, I think there are far more. I think that's certainly the case. There are far more Christians who are interested in Tibet or East Timor than there are Christians who are interested in other Christians in the Middle East and throughout this region where they're suffering. You know, it was a secular MP in Great Britain who said that a Christian is dying every 11 minutes around the world for his beliefs. And, of course, the vast majority of those are in Islamic nations or due to the pressure from Islamists, particularly in Africa and the Middle East. So I think that the fact that we are totally disengaged about the suffering of other members of the body of Christ is a scandal. It is something
and
that
we need to, we need to have that. Yeah, amen. And what we need to do is have a conversation earlier on next week to pursue that topic alone. Crane Durham, that is Ben Johnson, Party of Defeat, U.S. Bureau Chief, Life Side News, and guest host of Crane Durham's Nothing But Truth. Live with honor in your life, compassion in your heart. Our prayers to those who are suffering